Hello, welcome to the second part of my video on the history of Dearu, and Desu. This time we will be going over some of the theories on how Desu came to be. We will also go over the political and social history regarding the copulars Dearu, and Desu. We see these copulars all the time in modern Japanese, and they feel very natural to us. However, since the literary writing of Japanese and the everyday spoken form of Japanese have been separate for so long, there was a degree of tension as to which copulars would be used in the new national and standardized form of Japanese that was being decided in the Meiji period of the 1860s. There were very strong opinions from many different aisles of society on how this unification of written and spoken language should be achieved, and what copulars should be the language standard. With that in mind, let's begin the video. Let's start then by looking at some of the theories on how Desu came to be. It's surprising that such a common word in modern Japanese has an uncertain etymology. The first dictionary entry gives us quite a broad but not too in-depth etymology of Desu. Let me read it for you. In the Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, Desu began to be used mainly by women in the yuri, but it spread to the general public because it was imitated by the samurai from the provinces who gathered in Edo, present-day Tokyo. From the Meiji period, from 1868 to 1912, it began to be used as a polite term. Now, this first entry doesn't give us a huge amount of specificity, but it is really interesting that it uses the word yuri. This word that is highlighted means red district, an area where prostitution was permitted. As we work through the other theories, we will see a few times that Desu was used by women working in these, how should we call it, for a euphemism, the entertainment industry. It also suggests that Desu really began to be used widely after the Meiji era had begun, but we'd like more details. Let's move on to another source. The next source says the following. The expression Desu itself has existed since before the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. But at that time it was used only in special situations, and it is said that it was only from the end of the Edo period to the start of the Meiji period that it came to be treated as a general polite expression, as it is today. There are various theories as to the origin of the expression Desu, but it's not been specified. It is thought, though, that it could be an abbreviation of phrases such as de gozaimasu, de arimasu, or deso. If it was abbreviated from de gozaimasu to Desu, it seems inevitable that it would be further abbreviated to Su. Okay, fantastic. We have far more to work with here. The source again confirms that Desu existed before the Edo period, but it does not specify that its use began with women in the Muromachi period, as in the previous source. It also again corroborates that it was during the Meiji period that Desu really began to become widespread. But then, gratefully, it gives us a few specific details. It suggests that Desu either comes from an abbreviation of de gozaimasu, de arimasu, or deso. The source argues that the most convincing etymology is an abbreviation of de gozaimasu. The evidence it gives is that Su, a further abbreviation of Desu, and that the following chronology, de gozaimasu into Desu into Su, feels like a natural evolution. To interject another piece of evidence quickly is that de gozanzu is a term that was similarly used by prostitutes within the same Muromachi to Edo time period. Su itself is quite interesting. It's an abbreviation of Desu, so it's an abbreviation of a polite form of speech. For that reason, it sits in this weird realm of not being fully polite, but not being too rude either. My understanding was that it was typically used by young men, but to substantiate that claim a bit more, I had a look on High Native for answers from Japanese people. The general consensus seems to be that it's primarily associated with younger men. From the example on screen, oishii desu becomes oishu, and so desu becomes sosu. So that was rather interesting, but let's keep going. Let's look at more sources. So our next source goes as such. The Meiji period saw the publication of a series of Western conversational books using the Desu form, which are said to have pioneered the spread of the Desu form. Although there are scattered examples of forms of Desu in the late Edo period, the use of desho became commonplace in the 1890s. Of quick notice and interest is Yogaku, which means Western learning. You might recognize the kanji in other words like Yofuku, which means Western clothing. Now, the source doesn't necessarily disagree with the origins in our previous source, but it attributes the spread of Desu to Western learning conversational books. Now, I'm not 100% sure if the kanji used are referring to books written for a Japanese audience that explains the conversations of Western learning, i.e. books for learning other Western languages, or if it refers to books which discuss what Western audiences are talking about in the areas of academia, such as Western science. Bear in mind, the word Western is a very loaded term anyway, so when I say Western science, I do so because I'm working with what the kanji is giving me. I googled this word and found a few books that look like what is on screen. Apologies for the poor quality, there weren't many high quality photos that I could find. Okay, let's move on to our next source. We go back to our dear friend Bjarke Frelesig. He had the following to say. There was a word from Old Japanese, samarap, which meant to serve. Interestingly, the word samurai is related to samurap. Samurap in early Middle Japanese, 800 to 1200 AD, became sarao, and then in later Middle Japanese, 1200 to 1600 AD, sarao came to be used as a polite marker. He then states that sarao changed in sound to become soro. Soro was then combined with the copular de, i.e. the same de as in Dearu, to become Desu. Bjarke states that some scholars believe that this Desu is the origin of Desu. And finally, Bjarke explains that Desu was used in a style of formal writing called sorobun, in which soro was used to conclude sentences. Wow, that's quite a lot to take in, so let's look over that again. In late Middle Japanese, there was a polite marker that was read as soro. The word it came from, samurap, had a sense of serving and is related to the well-known word samurai. There was a formal style of writing known as sorobun. Remember that bun, the kanji at the end, refers to literary writing. So really, you can think of it as soro literature. It was called soro literature because sentences would be ended with some form of the word soro. Bjarke then states that some scholars think that when soro was combined with de to make polite copulars, such as deso, that this deso could be the origin of modern desu. To wrap up then, we ultimately don't know. Desu might have come from the language of prostitutes, from the Muromachi to Edo period. Conversely, it might come from sorobun, a literary form of writing in which polite copulars like deso were used. This deso might be the origin of desu. One other source attributed the widespread adoption of desu from Yogaku Kaiwa Sho. Desu could also just be a contraction of de gozaimasu. Really, just take your pick as to which one you find most convincing, as again, there is no singularly agreed upon etymology for desu. Now that we've spoken about some of the theories, let's look at a social chronology of how desu came to be used. Maybe this will help enlighten us. For clarity, this chronology comes from the website Waraku. I really love this website. They have loads of interesting articles on various cultural and historical things relating to Japan. They also do a few articles in English from time to time if you don't speak Japanese. The following chronology I'm going to reiterate comes from an article on the website. Now, I had a quick glance at the sources they used at the bottom of the article to write it. Generally, having read the articles on this website, Waraku, over time, I feel like I can trust the information that they tell me. Waraku articles almost always have academic sources attached to them, and I've never seen anything that seems glaringly like clickbait. However, unlike the previous etymology sources I found and translated, I'm largely just reiterating the information in this section from a Waraku article, which I will link. So just bear that in mind. We are only going to get a chronology of desu from one source, even if that one source, Waraku, got that information from multiple sources. So I would not take this section as academic gospel, and there are probably other academic opinions on the chronology of desu. So with that out of the way, here is their chronology of desu. This first part is really interesting as it supports what the other sources were saying, that Desu began in the Muromachi period. Furthermore, it states that Desu was actually used in Kyogen. Kyogen is literally mad words. I did a very brief look at Kyogen, but it appears to be some form of comedic theatre that developed alongside Noh, another form of theatre. So, interestingly, at this point there is no mention of prostitutes using the word. This next section explains the social usage of Desu a bit more. It states that in the latter half of the Edo period, Desu began to be used by a broader strata of society. It mentions specifically red light district geisha, provincial samurais, i.e. samurais that had come to Edo from other provinces, doctors and craftsmen. This seems to support what the other sources were saying about how Desu was used by women in the red light district, but it spans the roster of people who used Desu, such as craftsmen and doctors. Additionally, it states that towards the end of the Edo period, Desu was being used in everyday household conversations by men and women, but had a few forms. So you had Desu, Desho, and Deshi. This next section alludes to that social tension I was talking about at the start of the video. It states that intellectuals did not want to use Desu, as it was viewed as a sort of commoner word that was below them. They fiercely hung onto using Dearu and Da. Even today, if you look at Japanese academic papers, Da and Dearu tend to be used a lot. It's fascinating that the academic prestige of Da and Dearu has remained even into the present day. The Japanese text for this section is rather long, but there's a lot of interesting information there. I've left it on screen as evidence for what I'm stating, but there is no need to try and read it all. What I will do is pick out bits from it that I think are relevant. I would recommend, however, reading the original article yourself if you'd like to learn more. The source mentions Genbun Ichi, which was a term coined by intellectuals and writers who wanted the written and spoken language of Japanese to be the same. If you remember from my previous video, by the 1800s, the written form of Japanese was wildly out of touch with how people were speaking in everyday speech. The source mentions that Yamada Bimyo and Futabate Shime, two writers, were at the forefront of the Genbun Ichi movement. The two writers used Da and Desu in their literary works. Finally, we are told that in 1900, the Society for the Unification of Words in Writing sent a petition to Japan's parliament. This petition succeeded, and from 1903 onwards, national school textbooks began to be written in colloquial language, which led to Desu being used in these textbooks. The article itself is quite long, so I picked things out, so again I'd recommend reading the whole thing. But I hope that this has been an interesting dive into Desu. Hopefully, from all the sources and information I've spoken about, you can see that Desu is a very interesting word. It has a complex history and no agreed upon origin, which is surprising, given how common of a word it is in modern Japanese. This singular video couldn't cover every aspect of Desu, so if it's a topic that interests you, I'd implore you to go and read about the theories surrounding it. But thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed this video.